use this opportunity to introduce to you a little surprise by introduce a new online platform on maritime issues. So as President Nguyen Vu Thong already mentioned, among 7 international conferences, we have more than 200 publication papers, and some of them was published in international press, but it sometimes takes time, maybe months or years for a book or a chapter, something. So our initiative is to provide online platform for on-time publication of related research, policy recommendation on all aspects of maritime issues. So today we would like to launch the officially website maritimeissue.com or .org. So you can enter and visit the website. Along the website, we already got agreement with several international contributors, including from Australia, China, US, and some from South Asian country, from Japan. So among the contents, we focus on international law, international security, international economy, environment. On the issue of the outlets, we have several kinds of publication, including interview, working paper, podcast, conversation, and also book review. And to provide resources for researchers, we also collected relevant documents from international charities, from international agreements for your research. So that is the first stage of our website. And today we would like to introduce for you to have a look and we welcome any comments, recommendations, and especially we welcome contribution from own researchers, especially from today's participants of our conference. So please enter our website, maritimeissues.com. Thank you very much.
Now, we would like to go to the very first session of the conference today. The title is Origins of the South China Sea Disputes, Historical Perspective. And I would like to invite Associate Professor Nguyen Vu Thong, President of the Diplomatic Academy, Vietnam, to chair the sessions. And together I would like to invite Dr. Ulysses Granados, Coordinator of Asia Pacific Studies at Autonomous Technologies Institute of Mexico, Dr. Gerard Sanchez, Assistant Professor, Department of Southeast Asian Studies, National University, Singapore, Dr. François Xavier Bonnet, French Institute for Research and Contemporary Southeast Asia, and Mr. Bill Hayton, Associate Fellow of Chatham House, London, UK, to the panel. Professor Nguyen Vu Thong, floor is yours.
Good morning again, everyone. The panelists have been introduced, so I think just to save time, I would like to mention some of the few ground rules so that our presentations and discussions may follow with great ease. We have 4 papers for the first panels, which is focused on the historical background of the South China Sea issue. We have, like I mentioned in the opening remarks, we have organized 7 conferences, and each of the conference also have a section on historical background of the South China Sea disputes, and we will still want more. And that's why the organizers decided to have another historical panel when we have 4 distinguished scholars to present their findings. We also have, for the first time in the 8 conferences, scholars from Latin America countries. Yes, and that is an honor for us. So we put him in the first list of the people presenting. So Dr. Granados would be presenting first, and then as the schedule suggests, that we would have the 3 other panelists to join him. Each of the presenters would have between 15 and 20 minutes to present the papers, and the rest of the time would be spent for comments and questions and answers. And without further ado, I'd like to invite Dr. Ulysses Granados to take the floor.
Well, thank you very much for this invitation. First of all, I'm very glad, very honored to be here. What a challenge to try to explain in 10, 20 minutes the history of the South China Sea. It's a real challenge. It's impossible, but fortunately you have this presentation, written presentation in your file, so please try to follow me. The history of the South China Sea is very, very long. Everybody knows, and the research, the analysis of the history of the South China Sea, it is starting in the 20th century, as long as the dispute in itself. So I can say that we can identify patterns in time. I can identify 5. Next, please. Each I think it's not working. You can put enter manually if you want. Okay. So there is a long history in the study of the dispute, and but even though before 1910 Hillary Clinton declaration in Hanoi about the interest of the U.S., before that it was not very known in general in the international community. So especially after 2010 and especially now after this construction of artificial installations by the PRC, now the history of the conflict has become much more relevant and important for the general public. The structure of this presentation first is to show some patterns in time, the narrative crystallization and critical dates, interest in the area across time, and colonial legacies and nation building process, with some of my personal ideas of how historians might contribute to the study. Maybe not to the solution, but maybe to the understanding of the present and future situation in the South China Sea. The first, next please. We can identify 5 patterns in time. Can you change the slides, please? Okay. The first is which I call the imperial past, especially China and Vietnam. Second evolution is Western powers entrance into the South China Sea, but not only Europeans and Americans, but also the Japanese, starting in the early 20th century. This period covers up to the Second World War. So the first period, the imperial past, is characterized by the building of historiography, especially by Imperial China and Vietnam. So I must say that one important feature to me is that some records reflect a relatively vague and sometimes geographically inexact position of some insular features. So there are many holes in the narrative of this. During this second evolution of the disputes, Western powers entered the area, and Japan also, until the Second World War. The crystallization of narratives became much more stronger. A third period can be identified for the whole period of the Cold War, while the fourth evolution of the South China Sea conflict started roughly with the start of this ECAFE report in 1969, suggesting huge deposit of oil and gas there. The fifth and current period of this evolution of the South China Sea is characterized to me by four important features. First, rules, norms, and codes. So the building of international norms, rules, and especially the UNCLOS, relatively recent, since the 80s, 1994 especially. National laws. Each country, several countries have proclaimed their own internal laws. China, Vietnam, etc. Important feature of current stage of the dispute is the internationalizations. Everybody knows about that. Not only the US, but also Japan and some other non-claimant countries are participating directly or indirectly in the issues related to South China Sea. And finally, China's activities already reported by the media on these artificial constructions in those 7 features that already have control. So these patterns in time, these evolutions are very intertwined, and they have imprinted the very important features in the current conflict. So let me pass to the next one, narrative crystallization and the issue of critical dates of the dispute. Nowadays, critical date it's a contending issue. So we have been talking about each claimant through time have proposed and have identified some important dates for making their position very clear in the international community. Taiwan, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei. It is a contending issue because the critical date for international law specialists, it is very important. Supposedly, if we put this issue to international arbitration, the critical date, as you may already know, is very important. When there is no agreement, 1887, 1933 with the French incursion there, 1939 with the Japanese, 1952 with the entry into force of the San Francisco Peace Treaty and the Taiwan and Japan Peace Treaty, or it can be in 56 with the Thomas Clomas activities in the area, or it can be 84, 88 when the conflict in the Spratlys was a flashpoint in the international media, or in 1995 with this mischief reef incident, or it can be also 1999 or 2002 when the DOC was signed. So there are many authors speaking about different critical dates. Also, the problem here is that nationalist sentiments, emotional attachments, and personal bias preferences in narratives by especially historians from claimant states have shaped this narrative. So it's very difficult to separate the personal feelings and attachment to the countries for these historical debates. Let me go to a much more interesting issue, which is what are those interests in the area across time. So there are many factors contributing to the securitization of the disputes, so to speak. We can say first the geographical nature of the area, which from the ancient past was the Spratlys Sand parcels were considered as a dangerous place to be avoided. It can be the economic value through time. It can be, for instance, in ancient records, it says that Vietnamese fishermen were profiting from plundering shipwrecks in the parasols. And through time, guano deposits, fishery, and lately oil and gas have been very, very important to understand the securitization of these disputes. Also, nationalist and patriotic sentiments, as everybody knows that, about that. Philippines against Chinese actions, the Vietnamese feeling against the Chinese actions, especially after 1974. Also, we have ideology and a force of Cold War and decolonization after the Second World War. There are some debates still, I think, over the meaning of why the Spratly Islands and the Pearl Islands weren't mentioned much more clearly during the San Francisco Peace Conference. So this is a huge problem. It has to do with Cold War and decolonization. Of course, military importance of the area has been almost viewed as a myth, because how important the area is has been in the past. During the Second World War, we already know the Japanese were having a submarine base there, but with the new technologies, especially the Spratly Islands became not so important from the military perspective. That might change now if we think about this triangle, Spratly, Paracels, and Scarborough Shoal. But so far, military importance have been very, very emphasized. And of course, the last factor is the evolution of international law, especially after UNCLOS was ratified. So this is an important factor to be taken into account in the history. Colonial legacy is a nation building process as related with the disputes. Well, events shaped by the past, colonial legacy, and the process of nation building have been an important point of analysis for current disputes. And I just mentioned in my presentation that you already know the case of Brunei and Malaysia, which is the problem with this boundary delimitation. It's a British heritage. The other case is Malaysia and the Philippines, because the dispute, it involves disputes of islands, the sovereignty within this polygon of the KAG, and it has to do with the Paris Treaty at the end of the 19th century, and of course also with the 1930s between the UK and the US regarding North Borneo area. It's important here because the Philippines, they have a claim on North Borneo. So this dispute has been shelved for the future, but it is still going on. So as for the final thoughts and my conclusions, what is the role of history and the role of historians in the future of disputes? So, you know, unfortunately, we see a lot of limitations as an actors in proposing creative solutions for this conflict. Historians tend to be, especially if they belong to claimant states, as centrifugal forces against agreements. They are viewed as try to consolidate their own national positions. And of course, much more realist choices might be found without historians, like shelving the disputes for the future generations, third-party intervention or mediation, and of course negotiations, bilateral or multilateral negotiations. But having said that, I try to figure out some ideas on how historians here might help to better understand the present and future of this dispute. First, attention to sea economic activities performed by local residents should be one of the topics of research. We don't have to focus too much on oil and gas, but more on this. Historical presence of proposals, critical dates of the disputes, especially Scarborough Shoal, historical analysis of the issue of islands versus archipelagos. In the history, we tend to accept that the archipelagos are an entity. But why is that? And of course, digging into the history of sea activities by the Philippine, Malay, and Brunei individuals. I mean, the narrative, the history of those the activities by Philippine, Malay, and Brunei individuals are not very clear throughout history. So I think we should continue with historical analysis of these to prepare a more coherent narrative of the area. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Granados, for a very interesting presentation, which is the first one in the panel, and thank you again also for keeping track with the time. So I think you set the record here. That is a bar for us to follow. So the next panelist is Dr. Gerard Saskes. You have the floor, and the presentation is entitled Oceanography and the Making of the South China Sea. You have the floor.
Thank you, President Tum. And thank you to all the organizers for allowing me to be here today. And thank you to all of you for coming and listening to my very short presentation. My talk today is really about two things. It's about history and about the environment, about marine science. And looking at the program, I can't help but feel that in some sense, the history part is something that we just need to get through so we can get to the real stuff in the present day, all the other panels. But I'm glad that we're here to provide a little bit of context. But I was really happy to see in the opening remarks by President Tum and Chairman Guang that the environment is an important part of this discussion today. And it's what I'm here to do is to sort of think about discourses of the environment, of marine protection in the past, okay? So, as I was preparing this paper, I was looking around on websites about the dispute in the present day, and I came across this quote from an article published in 2015, and it's quite typical, I think. It really, sees, it has this narrative of the South China Sea being under threat, environmental threat caused by fishing fleets, building programs, and in this case, the threat is seen as coming from China. And when I read this, I couldn't help but be struck by its similarity to narratives that I was used to reading from the colonial past. And this is a quote from 1932, and it's essentially the same, except that the source of the threat is switched. It's not China in this case, it's Japan and the destructive practices of Japanese fishermen. Now, I'm less interested in the reality of these threats and more interested in how this notion of an environmental threat is operating as a discourse. This idea that there is this threat to the environment that can be apprehended by scientists, apprehended, described, and perhaps protected against by scientists. I'm also interested in how that discourse then actually interacts in powerful ways with policy in the past. So just from a disciplinary standpoint, I wanted to point out where I'm coming from as an historian, but also as an historian with coming from this science and technology studies background, which tries to think about science not as necessarily a positivist kind of enterprise which gradually produces more and better knowledge about the natural world, but rather as something that is situated in particular political, historical, geographic, cultural contexts. And I'd also like to think about that in another way too, is how, in a sense, the politics, the military activities, the diplomatic activities that we are so focused on normally when we talk about the South China Sea can also be shaped by their scientific contexts. And so to do that, I wanted to go back in the past and look at how this operated in the colonial period. Before we go there, I just wanted to, again, I love the sort of shifting focus between the present and the past. This is the research vessel, the Bien Dom, of the Vietnamese Institute of Oceanography, located here in Nha Trang. And this is apparently from its 2000 cruise, joint cruise between Vietnam and the Philippines across the South China Sea to the Spratlys and then on to the Philippines. And that's the cruise, the chart of the cruise in 2000. If we switch focus 80 years before, this is the research vessel of the Oceanographic Institute of Indochina, the De La Nation. And this is a corrected bathymetric chart that they produced after their cruise to the Spratlys in 1932. So all this to say, the Paracels and the Spratlys have been a focus of marine science for a long, long time. But what does that mean? I'm going to look at sort of three key points in this discourse and look at their relationship to policy in the colonial period. One of the first things that the Institute did when they first began operating in 1925 was to figure out where the fishing banks were located next to the Vietnamese or Indo-Chinese coast. And what they argued was that fishing stocks, for the most part, were confined to a very thin band along the coast. And they immediately began arguing that, or lobbying for the colonial government to increase the territorial waters of the colony from what was then the standard 3-mile limit to a 20-kilometer limit, and then to enforce a fishing ban within that limit. This is quite interesting because this is a very early, it's after World War II that we have the expansion of territorial waters for most countries. So what we have here is a Indo-Chinese government unilaterally extending its maritime boundary from 3 miles to 20 kilometers. And that at that time, there was really only one other country, Spain, which had a similar sort of extended limit. And it was also done ostensibly to protect maritime or fishing resources. So, and this actually happened. The Indo-Chinese government in 1935 drafted the legislation and expanded the maritime boundaries. So this is an important point where marine science really conditioned and really drove important policy changes. A second thing, they were very much interested in the Spratlys and the Paracels. They did multiple cruises out to both archipelagos, and they were very interested in trying to figure out how these archipelagos could be exploited, right? And I think this is a theoretical schematic of a phosphate islet from the Paracels. And this sort of underlines the way in which this process of knowing, of scientifically knowing, is often intrinsically bound with processes of economic exploitation. Okay. Now, the final aspect of this discourse is the one that I meant that opened this paper, which is this idea of a threat to these spaces, right? So one threat that they brought up was Japanese fishing fleets. A very powerful way of symbolizing that threat was to refer repeatedly to the practice of dynamite fishing and the destruction that would bring to these fragile ecosystems. Another threat that they brought up was the fact that Japanese businesses had already been exploiting the phosphates and the phosphate deposits in the Paracels and the Spratlys, which ostensibly could be exploited instead by French. So I think when you put these processes together of knowing these spaces, knowing these resources, and then put that together with this threat with this discourse of a threat from the outside, you really have important policy changes. So one would be the expansion of the territorial waters of Indochina. And then the other is, of course, what I call this sort of slow sovereignty, the very slow kind of assertions of sovereignty by the French colonial state over the Spratlys and the Paracels, which really only begin in the very late in 1928, 1929, and really are only concretized very late in 1938. This was the first time that the French actually built something on either of the archipelagos, when they built a lighthouse in Paddle Island in 1938. But again, even how they took possession of these spaces, I think underlines the connection with science, because the next move by the French was to create a meteorological station, a weather station. They didn't send troops, they built weather stations. So again, it shows us really powerful interaction, how science is really providing context, shaping, and driving policy in the colonial period. And And so, that sort of, to end off, I wanted to bring us back to the present, right? And I'm going to return us to that article I started off with from 2015 on the web. And I'm going to try and kind of think about how, going with my argument that science is an important shaper and driver of, or can be an important shaper and driver of policy, I want to sort of think about, how that it can drive these things in ambiguous ways, right? And so this is, I think, a nice way of illustrating kind of one direction that marine science can go in. One thing that's very interesting about marine science is it's talking about the oceans. Oceans are very hard to confine within national borders, right? And so this schematic, this diagram from that article shows that very nicely. It shows the plankton flows across the years, across the South China Sea all the way up to Japan and down to Australia. And it really underlines the way in which any solution, any viable solution to the South China Sea disputes really has to take into account the fact that this can't be solved, unilaterally. It has to be done multilaterally, right? But that said, there's this other aspect of marine science, which is the way in which it is so often done within national borders, and where national sort of narratives still, in a sense, provide the context for much of marine science. So this figure accompanies the article. It's a second figure. And I really love it because it basically what it's showing is that the marine life in the Spratlys is genetically Filipino, which I think is quite interesting, right? So I think those two diagrams really illustrate this fundamental, one of the fundamental ambiguities of marine science in this dispute. One is the way in which it is, dealing with problems that are, in a sense, global, and the ways, and there are many institutions which are multinational, multilateral, and provide really promising frameworks for this sort of multinational and multilateral resolution of these problems. And yet, at the same time, you have this ambiguity, the way in which marine science often is done within national institutions, and often can be caught, implicated in, national imperatives, particularly ones related to resource exploitation. So that really is, how I'm going to end off. I end off all my talks is basically saying these things are very ambiguous. But that said, I think marine science is this potentially very powerful element of this dispute, and perhaps an important way of suggesting a way forward. Okay, thank you very much.
Next, I would like to invite Dr. François-Xavier Bonnet to take the floor. And the theme of the presentation is about geopolitics of the Spratly Islands, secret sea lanes, and submarines. Very exciting, eh?
Thank you very much, Dr. Tong. And thank you very much also for all the three organizers for the invitation. My paper today, it's about, generally in the media or in the scholarship, in the document, we always talk about the main factors, the main drivers as a dispute about oil, gas, and fishing. But we forgot generally one factor, which is, I think, a very important one, and I will disagree a little bit with Luis about it. It's the aspect for the submarines and for military aspects. I will show you that the sea lanes inside the Spratly can be used by traditional nuclear submarines, traditional and nuclear, and can be a potential threat for the region. The traditional view on the Spratly is generally that it's a dangerous ground, and it's described as shallow and extremely dangerous for the navigation, and to be avoided at all costs. So in the literature, I would say the traditional view can be seen by, shown by the Rear Admiral Arthur McCollum, who in 1970s was interviewed by John Mason for a book on the Pacific War Remembered, an oral history. In this book, he was asked about Mr. Mason about the role of the Spratly during the Second World War, during the Pacific War. And the Rear Admiral was saying that in fact, this dangerous ground was not used at all during the war, and that Japanese and American Navy were avoiding this area, were in fact using the main sea lanes around the dangerous ground and the Spratly. Because at this time the Spratly was also called dangerous ground. And it was uncharted and full of reef. There was, in fact, for him, the story of sharks and secret sea lanes where all this was bourgeois about how the Japanese had better sharks than the Americans. And he was saying that the Americans had good or even better sharks than the Japanese. That they compared the sharks. However, in several years after the book on the Pacific War, one geographer, Victor Prescott, and one navigator, David and Cox, they have shown in 1999 that there were really secret surveys before the war. And so the British, the Japanese Navy started all their first surveys in the 1925 up to 1938. And they discovered secret sea lanes crossing the dangerous ground from south to north. The US Navy itself also started its own secret surveys in 1935, and they were more interested by mapping the bathymetry of this area for their own submarine in preparation for the war. And they discovered a sea lane with east-west, or we will say southeast and southeast-northwest direction. And the survey was so well done that, in fact, the Navy Commandant Undusoke Kokukara in 1939 was saying that the Spratly can be seen as a fortress, and because on the charts, civilian charts, it was like a white area, so no sea lanes could appear on these charts. And so no civilian boats could cross this area, except for the case of Japanese civilians and military boats. The US State Department itself protested secretly the Japanese annexation of the Spratly in 1939 by the Japanese. And this protest was deeply influenced by a confidential memorandum of the US Navy written in April 5, 1939, which explicitly used its secret survey in the eastern part of the dangerous ground as an argument to protest. In this note, it was written, in fact, because of the secret surveys in the proximity of the Philippines, the claim of the United States on the dangerous ground is not inferior to that of Japan, meaning maybe Americans also could have their own claim on the Spratly. So this is a map of the different secret sea lanes. So here we have the southeast, northwest, the Pigeon Passage discovered by the American Navy. Here it's the south-north sea lane, and you have also different sea lanes here, which were also mapped by the British and by the Japanese. And during the war, the supertanker from Borneo, a Japanese supertanker, were bringing oil to Taiwan and after Japan, passing through the sea lane. And so I will show you the Japanese, the American submarines were posting themselves in ambush in this area to attack the convoys of the Japanese tankers. One spot where they can also replenish their energy, it was in Ituaba, because generally Ituaba, it is said that it was it was a submarine base by the Japanese, but in fact there is no evidence of a submarine base in Ituaba, but it was an area to stock gasoline and different, to replenish the boats, military and civilians boats. The first American submarines to have patrolled the Spratly was the USS Sculpin from June 15 to July 3, 1942. And I would like to attract your attention on the fact that it's USS Sculpin, because 80 years later it will be another USS Sculpin, but a nuclear submarine. So his first mission, in fact, was to patrol around Spratly Island proper, and he discovered that Spratly Island itself was a desert, no habitation, no buildings. During also the Second World War, the US submarines continued their secret research, particularly in bathymetry and density layers for protections against Japanese detection with their sonars. And after the war, probably the US submarines continued their own research because so 80 years later, you have another Sculpin, USS Sculpin, but this time the nuclear submarine, who crossed probably for the first time the dangerous ground. So the description of the journey of the USS Sculpin in 1972 was described in Naval History magazine in 2008. The official mission was to track and neutralize the fishing boats carrying weapons and ammunition from the Viet Minh. These fishing boats were leaving Hainan, passing through the Spratly, and then reaching some areas in coastal Vietnam. The journey was described in this manner. So globally, they leave from Hainan and reach the dangerous ground. And the Commandant Harris said that they arrived in dangerous ground, but they had only the charts of 1885, meaning charts made by the British during the 19th century. So the writer, in fact, probably had to expurge a part of information, notably on the secret surveys after the 19th century. So it's a difficulty to accept, in fact, that after all the history of secret survey during the 1925 to 1930, 1940, and after the continuing research during the Second World War on the bathymetry, it's difficult to accept that a nuclear submarines was using, a crew was using a 19th century chart. And it shows, in fact, the sensitivity of the question of the charts. As this text was published in 2007, but the description looks like the one of Rear Admiral McCollum in 1970. Or even if you read the navigator's description of the dangerous ground in the 19th century, it's approximately the same kind of description. So our hypothesis is that the USS Sculpin was either testing the results of the previous surveys or making its own researches with the help of an airplane P-3 Orion. We have the same also in the Philippines. In a government document in 1982, it was also read that the area has never been adequately surveyed or mapped, but it is known to contain many islands, banks, and reef shoals and cays separated by deep passages. If a hostile nation can map the area to a degree which will enable the navigation of submerged ballistic missile submarines without danger of running aground, that particular nation can station Polaris type of submarines in the island group and be able to control or threaten an area within a radius of 4,000 kilometers, containing 1/3 of the world population, including the whole ASEAN. So the area bathymetry makes submarine detections and counteraction virtually impossible. In fact, if we go back to the map, we have an area which is structured by different sea lanes, the two axes, south-north and east-west, but also some smaller areas, smaller sea lanes. In fact, the whole occupation of this area followed these different sea lanes. So, for example, Taiwan took the control of Ituaba, but Philippines took the control of the northern part of the north-south sea lane, and Vietnam, it was the west part of the east-west sea lane. And after that, China, the whole strategy of China was to control occupying the reef and to control the area along the sea lanes east-west and north-south, especially Mischief and Fiery Cross, which are very strategic for the control of these different sea lanes. To conclude, in fact, I think there is a real importance to neutralize the maritime space of this area, the dangerous ground, to guarantee the rights of freedom of navigation, and eventually to sign a denuclearization of the Treaty for the Dangerous Ground as a first step before extending the rule of the South China Sea. The whole history of the Spratley since the 20th century has always been to avoid that one nation can control the whole of the archipelago. And so ASEAN, among other institutions, should make sure that this principle is respected. Thank you very much for the patience.
Thank you, Dr. Bonin. Now, I would like to invite Mr. Bill Hayden to take the floor.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a great honor to be here, to be at my second South China Sea Conference. And I should say that my paper builds on the great research of my three colleagues here. So I'm really pleased. This is the first time that we've all been in the same room together. I'm really happy we're all here today. It begins halfway through the story, but it builds a bit on what my colleagues have already said today. So I'm going to start in 1930. And I should say that most of my sources, I don't speak Chinese, so a lot of this has been in translation. And I tend to use newspapers because I'm tracking the emotional claim that's emerged in China towards the features of the South China Sea during the mid-20th century. Now, the basic narrative is that there was no interest really in China in the South China Sea islets before 1909, and yet 40 years later they became an integral part of Chinese territory. So the story is, how did that change in attitudes come to be? And I wanted to trace that process. Here's an atlas produced in 1914, and you can see that there's a sense that the paracels belong to China, but the Spratleys and Scarborough Shoal aren't even mentioned. So you can see dramatically. There's a better map, but it's actually been, this is from University of British Columbia Library in Canada, but the first map's actually been stolen from the atlas with a razor blade. There's the picture that Gerard showed us a bit earlier. France basically gets in on the game in the 1920s, and that then triggers a whole lot of reactions in China. That's where I'll start. Sorry, there's a lot of text on this, but a lot of things happen at once immediately after 1930. So there's a new central government installed in China, and then it begins a process of trying to regularize the country's maps, in effect trying to define the country's borders by creating a maps inspection committee under new regulations. But it takes a very long time for that committee to actually get around to meeting. It doesn't meet till 1933. Meanwhile, the Chinese-Japanese conflict is getting worse, and the invasion of Manchuria in 1931, that puts the government in Nanjing under a lot of pressure. And at the same time, the French formally claim sovereignty over the Paracel Islands in December 1931. And the Chinese response to that doesn't come for about just over 6 months later until July 1932. Now, by this time, power in China has split. So there's the government in Nanjing under Chiang Kai-shek, but then there are the anti-Chiang Kai-shek factions have formed what's called the Southwest Political Council, based in Guangzhou. They are a rival government, and they basically spend most of their time attacking any concessions that the Nanjing government makes to anybody, whether they be Japanese or French, for that matter. So you get these two rival sources of power, and this is very important in what happens in the South China Sea subsequently. Now, the French, having claimed sovereignty over the Paracels in 1931, formally annex 6 of the Spratly Islands on Bastille Day, 1933, the 14th of July, that's when it's announced. And then 12 days later, an announcement appears in the official French government outlet, the Journal Officiel. For some reason, they announce it on the 25th, and then they re-announce it the following day. I think there must be a misprint or something in the first announcement. And this is then reported in French newspapers and also in Shenbao, in the Chinese newspaper, which is published in Shanghai. And in these announcements, they note the latitude and the longitude of the islands, the Spratly Islands, and that they're roughly somewhere between Saigon and the Philippines. However, immediately it's clear there's confusion about exactly which islands the French have annexed. So, for example, by Shenbao, the Chinese paper, it says that the Chinese Foreign Ministry is trying to find out more about the situation, and as Francois Xavier has shown, they ask the Chinese consul in Manila to ask the Americans for a map to tell them where the islands are which the French have annexed. And Francois has found the documentation for that. But you can see here, for example, in the English language, in the North China Herald, the reports that these islands correspond to what the Chinese and the Xisha are incorrect. There's a dispute about whether these are the Xisha, the Paracels, or the Spratlys in China. And this confusion goes on and on and on for several weeks. But from the government's point of view, from the Nanjing government's point of view, the central government, the internationally recognized government, the confusion is cleared up relatively quickly. By August, it becomes clear that the Nanjing government is satisfied that the islands which the French have annexed are the Spratlys and that they are not the Paracels, and therefore they are not bothered, frankly, about it. There's no sense of a Chinese claim to the Spratlys. Meanwhile, the rival government, the Southwest Political Council, based in Guangzhou, continues to agitate against the French, convinced that the French have actually annexed and occupied the Paracel Islands. They're just simply wrong about that, but they can't be told anything other than that. So the agitation continues, and there are all kinds of protests and civic actions in many parts of China about the French annexation at this point. And then someone re-enters the frame to confuse matters even further. A Chinese admiral from the end of the Qing, Li Jun, he returns. He was the Chinese admiral who claimed the Paracel Islands in 1909, first of all, and wrote a little memoir about them. He goes into retirement after the end of the Qing dynasty and the birth of the Republic, but then comes back in 1933 and gives interviews to newspapers and basically tells them that the islands which the French have annexed are the same ones that he stuck a flag in 1909, which they are not. But he muddies the waters and confuses everybody once again. And what's interesting is that a lot of the English language writing about the South China Sea disputes is actually based on Chinese magazine articles which were based on his testimony, which were wrong in 1933 and continue to be wrong all the way to the present day. So despite all of this, these protestations, the Chinese government decides that it has no claim in the Spratly Islands and does not protest against the French annexation. And again, Francois Xavier has found the minutes of the military committee meeting from September 1933 in which the Chinese government says it has no claim in the Spratly Islands. And then to try to explain that to the public, it then publishes an article, a very long article, in its own government gazette, in which it tries to explain to the Chinese public about the fact that there are two different sets of islands and that the French have claimed one set and that the Chinese claim a different set. So by the end of 1933, what you have is a massive interest in the question in the Chinese media and among nationalist groups, but a great confusion about which islands are being annexed. But ultimately, the central government decides not to protest against the French annexation of the Spratlys. But it then takes on a new life. And so the committee charged with regularizing the maps, the Maps Inspection Committee, in 1934 publishes a list of the Chinese names for the features in the South China Sea. But interestingly, these are not indigenous Chinese names, by and large. They are simply translations or transliterations of the names used on English maps, some are Chinese, for example, like Subi Reef, some are Malay, like Pasukia, some have a variety of other origins. So what's interesting to me is to find out where this list came from. And that's actually relatively easy these days because there are mistakes in this list that was published in 1934. And it took about 10 minutes on Google Books to find out what other publications have the same mistakes. And it became rapidly clear that the Chinese simply copied a list that was published in English in the China Sea Directory of 1906 because the mistakes are the same in both. And again, I think it was you that alerted me to the fact that that list was there. But this then takes on a bit more of a life because it's then published on a map, and you can see that these names, these English names, transliterated into Chinese, are then published in Chinese in 1935. But it's not clear to me, in fact I don't think it's the case, that China was asserting a claim to the Spratly Islands at this point. It was simply publishing a map with names on it at this point, in the same way that the fact that Manila is named in Chinese doesn't imply a Chinese claim to Manila. But what's intrigued me is why the James Shoal, at the very bottom of the map, becomes the southernmost point of Chinese territory at this point. And there's a misunderstanding here because the Chinese committee mistranslates the word shoal, which in English just means shallow, and they use the word tan, which means sandbank. And so they create an island which doesn't actually exist by a translation mistake at this point. And the question to me is why did they choose an obscure underwater feature to become the southernmost point of Chinese territory and to put it on their maps? And my hypothesis, I can't prove this yet, is that they simply copied another British map. So this map is published in 1918, and you'll see it gives particular prominence to the James Shoal here and to the Vanguard Bank here. And you see they're marked with dotted lines here, not as islands with solid lines. And James Shoal becomes an island on this list. The name is changed in 1947 to become Ansha, which is a slightly more accurate term. But anyway, it's Shoal in 1934-35. It's this man, Bai Mei Chu, founder of the China Geographical Society, who produces his own map in 1936. And you'll see that he marks the James Shoal and the Vanguard Bank as islands here. He draws a solid line around them. It's his mistake. And then he draws a line around it to mark some kind of Chinese claim to it. So this man makes a mistake based on a British map, which becomes the Chinese claim to the South China Sea, ultimately. And the transmission mechanism, I'll skip this for time, is that two of his students, one goes on to study in Germany, one goes on to study in Japan. They are then hired by the Chinese Minister of the Interior to define the territory that China is going to claim at the end of the Second World War. They incorporate all the various mistakes which have been made over the previous couple of decades, and then are advising the government about which to claim, partly prompted by the Philippine claim to the islands in 1946. This is the first ever state map published in the Republic of China, which shows a dashed line around the South China Sea. The others have been private initiatives. This is produced by the government internally for a meeting in September 1946, which then guides the naval expedition, which goes down to the Spratlys and to the Paracels. And again, there are confusions about the name. The Chinese characters are incorrect here. A competition between the French and the Chinese to who's going to grab which island first. The French get to the Spratlys first, the Chinese get to the Paracels first, in effect. And they land. The first time any Chinese official lands on any of the Spratly Islands, December 1946. So it's only after, and so even at this point, this is a document published by, again, I got this from you, from the Chinese Ministry of Information, setting out the territory of China, and you'll point out they're still not even using the word Nansha at this point. They're still calling them the Tuansha, the chaotic sands, a translation of a dangerous ground, and still regarding them as disputed at this point. It's not until further committees are meeting in late 1947-48 that the claim formally extends down to include the Spratlys and as far south as the James Shoal. That's a rather abbreviated explanation of what happened, but if anybody wants more details, I'm very happy to carry on. Okay, thank you.
Wonderful. We have 4 excellent presentations about the historical background of the South China Sea dispute. We have about 25 minutes for Q&A and comments. And please raise your name plate so that I can see who is wishing to speak. And then identify yourself, your name and your affiliation. So the floor is now open. I have one gentleman here. And then I have, yes, 2. Yes, yes. Now I would like to invite our, yes, colleagues here.
Thank you, President Tong.
And
Thank you very much. I have 3 brief questions addressed to Mr. Hayton. The first question is about the linkage between the 1945 Truman Proclamation and the claim to the Spratly Islands, because the Philippines declared that the ownership of the island in July 1946. And I read the historic archives mentioning that kind of connection. So that's the first question to you. The second question, I think in your book published in 2014, the title is South China Sea, subtitle is The Struggle for Power in Asia. And you mentioned at the end of your book that perhaps Taiwan is holding the key in terms of interpreting correct South China Sea history. Are you still holding that view? And final question is about December 12th this year. If you were the advisor to the Taiwan's new president, Tsai Ing-wen, will you advise her to visit Ituaba, Taiping Island, next month on 12th? If yes, why? If no, on what ground? Thank you very much.
Could you kindly identify yourself, please?
I'm sorry. My name is Yang Hui Song. I'm the research fellow from Academia Sinica, Taiwan. Thank you.
I believe that James, you have the floor. Please.
Thank you. James Borton from the U.S. Asia Institute in Washington, D.C., where I'm a senior fellow. First of all, I want to thank all our distinguished panelists for reminding us that there are lessons that we can learn from history, and our past, time present, time future are all interconnected. This is really directed to Professor Gerard Saskis. I really thank you again for your presentation and connecting the possible role of marine science and policy development here in the contested South China Sea, something I've been writing about for quite some time. You touched on the idea of how science can be an important driver of policy for these claimant nations. How do you envision science diplomacy really contributing to a new narrative, a new conversation for trust-building mechanisms that are really urgently needed now, trust-building mechanisms in the form of perhaps cooperative marine science research activities, perhaps calling upon our friends even in China that can contribute a large research vessel for multilateral science research activities and what we can learn from that. So this is what I've been thinking about. Thank you.
May I collect two more people? Rajit, you have the floor.
Thank you, sir. My name is Abhijit Singh. I'm a senior fellow at the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi. I have two questions. My first question is for Dr. Bonnet. So the idea of submarine operations in the South China Sea is not really a new one. It has been discussed earlier. And there are studies that show that while it's really theoretically possible to use submarines for real warfare in the South China Sea, it might not be a very probable scenario because all the sides seem to be interested only in a display of force to dominate the region. There is no willingness to actually use force. And most of the posturing that occurs, it really occurs only in peacetime. That is the real tactic, not to go to war, but to just display strength in peacetime to maximize your positions and your leverages. I want to know from you what do you think about submarine operations in the sense that is it ever likely to lead to a real conflict between the navies that are operating their submarines in the region? And my second question is to Bill. Bill, your book has attracted a lot of attention, at least in India. It has been the subject of many discussions, as I was mentioning to you. But I want to know from you, it has been your contention, one of the key points that you make in your book is that China has never really made any claims to all the waters within the 9 dotted line. And yet the fact is that in 2009, when China did make a submission to the CLCS, it did claim the adjacent waters to the islands and all the relevant waters, which is in effect all the space within the 9 dotted line. So isn't there a difference between these two positions in the sense that one states that you're claiming all the waters, and second, de facto claims all the waters? I want your comment on that. Thank you.
Yes, you have the floor.
Richard Hidarian from the Philippines. It could be for anyone in the panel. To what degree do you think that the high strategic stakes and the politicization of the historical or historiography of South China Sea has made it almost impossible for us to come up with a neutral account of what has been happening in the South China Sea? Because what I realize is that sometimes it depends on who you ask. Scholars from certain countries have a completely different take on what South China Sea disputes and how they have evolved over time. Do you think it's possible to really have a neutral, objective study of the South China Sea disputes in light of the high politicization of the issue?
Good. I think that we have collected quite a good number of questions. I'd like to invite Bill to respond first, because it seems that most of the questions are directed to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you all. They were all excellent questions. Richard's one very briefly first. I don't think it's possible to write a completely comprehensive history of the South China Sea, but I think it's possible to test the evidence that various people put forward and see whether the base that they use for that evidence actually exists or does what it says it does. And that's what I've tried to do. Your three questions from Yan Wei Song. I haven't found anything that specifically links the Truman Declaration to, but then I don't read Chinese. So I'm working on material that's been produced in English based on the workings of people that have been reading the Chinese. Have you come across Chris Chung yet? Have you met him? He's a Canadian-Chinese PhD student at the University of Toronto doing his PhD on 1946-47, currently in Taiwan, or maybe he's just left, looking at the archives. So he's really digging into this, this material. I think that's why Taiwan holds the key, because Taiwan's archives are open. And these are the most important archives. They are the archives from when the claim was developing in 1935 and then up to 46, 47. And they are open, and Taiwan is a place where you can have a free and open debate about these things. And in the Republic of China, in the People's Republic, there are, the archives don't exist. Those that do exist are closed, and there is no chance of an open debate. So that's why I think, Taiwan is where, one should have a good debate about this history. And particularly now with the current government, it might be more possible to have that debate than under the KMT, perhaps. In terms of going there, because the 12th of December will be the 70th anniversary of the Chinese claim in the Spratly Islands. It might be quite a nice thing to do to make Taiwan feel better. I think in terms of a solution to the disputes, it's unrealistic to expect any of the claimants to withdraw from the features that they currently hold. It's just politically not going to happen. So therefore, they're going to hang on to what they've got. So therefore, they could celebrate the fact that they, still have these sovereignty claims. The real problem, and this links a bit to to Mr. Singh's question about what China actually claims in terms of the waters. Well, obviously the question is that you're not entirely sure. They use the phrase relevant waters or adjacent waters. But the best account of it is a three-part claim: a claim to the sovereignty of the islands themselves, a claim to UNCLOS-based entitlements around the features, the rocks, and the reefs. And those two parts of the claim are entirely compatible with commonly understood international law. You can dispute the details. You can say they don't have a claim to this island or that reef. But the actual basis of the claim is itself rational. The third part is a claim to historic rights inside all the waters encompassed within the U-shaped line, which is very vaguely defined, is entirely incompatible with UNCLOS. And from the archives that we have in Taiwan from 46, 47, it's clear that there was never any intention back then that China was claiming rights across the entire U-shaped line. This line was simply a graphical device to show which rocks, reefs, and islands were being claimed by the Republic of China. It wasn't intended to say that every single fish that lies within this line belongs to China. So if Tsai Ing-wen wants to go to Taiping Dao in a month's time and say, this is our island, but our archives clearly show that we never intended to claim historic rights, then that would be a major step forward for peace for the entire region, I think.
I believe that the next person is...
Thank you for your question. I'm glad you share my faith in science to shape policy. I think to reply to your question, I'll point to two things. One, again, I think science is this, provides a quite interesting framework because it is so multinational in how it's conducted. Just thinking, one of the things I think about as an historian is how science cuts across in weird ways the political divisions that we take for granted. So, one thing I look at is for example, after 1975, like ongoing connections, ongoing scientific exchange between, the now Socialist Republic of Vietnam and places like France or the United States, most notably. So, just the other day, I was speaking with Võ Sĩ Tuấn, the director of the research or the Oceanographic Institute here, and he told me the story about how in 1995 he was doing some diving in Nha Trang Bay with some scientists from Australia and the United States, and it was actually at the point when Vietnam and the United States normalized relations, and so his American colleague turned to him and said, "Oh, I guess we can be friends now." So I think that sort of points to the fact that even if things are, on the official level, on the upper level, are officially divided, science provides ways to make these connections nonetheless. And I think that's the second point that I would point to is how, states, when they make public commitments to, defending territory to the death and things, these are things that are hard to go back on in a public way. And yet, scientific initiatives are sort of a very quiet way to kind of go in another direction. And so, I think the example of the Jamsri cruises, the joint operations between Vietnam and the Philippines that started in the 1990s and went on for more than a decade, provide a really excellent model. So I think if states, sort of really take that opportunity to, publicly before their, important, sort of domestic publics, they can, still seem to be, protecting national interests, and yet, quietly behind the scenes be promoting these, joint scientific initiatives. This, as you say, could be a really important way to, build confidence and try and sort of come up with alternative solutions that, can better, address the multiple audiences, concerns that governments have to be worrying about. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Teng Jinqing from China Institute of International Studies. I just want to have a quick follow-up to Jared's study on the maritime science. I think the most important arrangement in the maritime science research should be the construction of the observation station by the Chinese government in Yongshu Reef, which was finished in 1988. It was an assignment from the UNESCO Maritime Committee, and so far the station has already submitted about 2.5 million pieces of meteorological information to WMO. That's very important for the science research. Thank you.
Michael McDevitt from CNA. I wanted to make an observation on Professor Bonnet's very interesting paper. It's important to remember how uncertain navigation at sea was in the days before global positioning or even radar on ship and what have you, so that even the very best possible celestial fix that you could get with stars had an accuracy of perhaps plus or minus 2 nautical miles. And then you combine that with the uncertainty of the surveys of the reefs and islands. Nobody knew for sure what was there in toto. And finally, the survey of water depth. And so it is quite a feat of maritime oceanography by the Japanese, if they were the first ones to in fact do the survey of those the water depths in and around the Spratly, so you could perceive that there was deep enough water to transit east and west and north and south. But once those things are done and are put on a chart, they are no longer secret sea lanes. Everybody knows about them. And the one thing about those kinds of sea lanes that cross in the midst of very shallow water is once you're committed to them, you're stuck. You got to keep going, or you have a very little bit of room to turn around. You can't wander off anywhere you feel like. And so there is a certain aspect of once you start wandering through these sea lines, through the islands, you've got to keep going, and that also means that somebody knows where you're going to come out. And so it needs to be put in perspective, I think, of what some of the very fascinating bits of research you've conducted.
May I invite more questions from the audience? If the song, you have the second chance. Yes.
Thank you very much. Yang Wei Song from Academia Sinica. Second questions. Mr. Hayton, in your book, you mentioned about Ituaba has fresh water and can minimum maintain human habitation. After July award issued by the tribunal. Do you still hold that position, or you change your position? That's the first question. The second question, you also mentioned in your book. I read your book carefully. Your book, you mentioned that if the claimants decided to go to the court or tribunal to settle their disputes, and because Ituaba has been under Taiwan's occupation over nearly 70 years, and you say that the winner will be Taiwan. Are you still holding that view? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Obviously, I'm still waiting for my invitation to actually visit Ituaba and test the water. So, I mean, I was based on other reports, but I think the thing about what people have said, but obviously there is water on Ituaba, but the judges at the tribunal that ruled or delivered the ruling in July came up with a very sophisticated definition of what it means to be able to support human habitation. So according to that definition, and I don't see any reason why anybody should try and say that they know better than 5 judges with a combined 3 centuries of experience or whatever on, maritime law. I mean, these are 5 of the most expert people who understand maritime law on the planet. So why try and pretend that they know nothing? So if they come up with a definition of what it means to support human habitation based on everything that's happened in maritime law over the last 3 centuries, then why try and pretend that they're idiots? So that's the definition they came up with. As a matter of historical record, there is no evidence of permanent occupation of any of the Paracels or Spratly Islands. Yes, seasonal occupation by fisher people who came for a season, and then when the typhoons came, they left. But never any permanent occupation. So it cannot sustain human habitation in a meaningful sense. Robinson Crusoe may be able to survive for a few years, but that doesn't count as a sustainable population. So I just think it's not even worth arguing about that anymore. I mean, they've made their decision, let's move on. Now, the other question as to whether a claim to Ituaba amounts to a claim to the Spratlys, I'm going to knock it back to somebody who knows more about international law. If you claim one island on a reef system, is that just a claim to that particular feature? Is it a claim to the reef system? There are substantial deep areas of deep water between the bank that Ituaba sits on and the next door bank, which some of the other features sit on, and then many, many nautical miles before you get to some of the others. So by claiming one, does that allow you to then claim all of the others, or do you have to stick your flag in all of them? Fiery Cross Reef is an awful long way from Ituaba, for example, or Amboina Key or something like that. So, but that's possibly a question for an international lawyer, and I'm not sure what precedent says about these things. I'm going to look at Bob Beckman to answer that question, maybe not now, but later.
In the few remaining minutes, I'd like to invite the rest of the panels to join us, to share with us the final thoughts. So may I invite Professor Bonnet? Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry, I did not answer your question because I didn't really understand what you asked me a few minutes ago.
I was trying to ask you a question about submarine operations in the South China Sea. And I wanted to know from you whether it is really a realistic prospect, a realistic scenario, submarines being used for warfare. Because my understanding of the South China Sea is that the display of strength is simply a peacetime activity. No side actually wants to go to war. So while there might be ships and there might be, use of militias, the sort of naval armament that can be seen, there will never be a situation in which the sides will actually use naval warfare against each other. Could I have your comments on this? Because submarines are hidden. They're not visible. And it makes little sense for all the sides to use submarines to either interdict the sea lanes or attack each other.
Yeah. The problem is the Malacca Strait is too shallow to have underwater submarines. So you have only to pass by Lombok Strait. And one way is to control the sea lane is to have stations in the north-south sea lane of the dangerous ground, and also to pass by Balabac Strait and Sulu Sea and Celebes Sea, and to reach the Indian Ocean through the Lombok Strait. It's a way to be normally completely hidden for the submarines, with a limit in the Balabac Strait, which is quite shallow also.
Good. Now I'd like to invite Dr. Sasket to share with us the finding, the final thoughts, and then Dr. Granados. Yes.
Okay, I don't have too much to say. Maybe just I'll just work off of Bill Hayton's comment that he's waiting for his invitation to come to Itu Aba to sample the water. Maybe that could be you know, maybe you should invite Bill and some Vietnamese scientists and some Filipino scientists. And I mean, that's sort of my point, is that perhaps science is this way to start making connections and providing, you know, sort of alternative ways of thinking about this dispute. Thank you.
Well, I would like to add just a few words. The objective study of South China Sea it's almost impossible. It cannot be neutral. The constructed history of South China Sea is particularly difficult because history is based on past historiography. So, you know, even non-claimant narratives are based on some sources and not the others. Science is not neutral. Social sciences less. So this is one final thought, and the other is that something related to UNCLOS. I mean, what might seem here as an apparently unsolvable problem is that the South China Sea disputes relate first to the sovereignty of territory, and after that, late state jurisdiction at sea. I really think that codification of current, more advanced international norms might still be insufficient in dealing with this problem. That's all I wanted to say.
May I invite you to join me in appreciation of the four excellent papers that are not only keep track with the time, but also good enough to invite good questions and comments from the audience. So please join me in giving a big hand to the panelists.